Hi, I'm Lois Powell. And I'm Susan Schuler, and we're here to share tips, tricks, ideas, and resources to help you discover what's your story.
Hey, Lois, happy summer.
Well, happy summer to you too, Susan.
Thank you.
Pretty exciting day today because we got a special guest.
We do have a special guest, a guest I've wanted for a long time. Should we roll right into it?
I think we should.
Excellent. So anybody who's ever visited the East Lake Library knows Joan McCarthy. She's the manager of our book nook, our book sale area. She's a big friend of the library in every sense of the word. She's on our advisory board. She's worn many, many hats here at our library, but we know her as a really great genealogist. Joan, good morning.
Good morning, Susan. Hi, Lois. Good
Good
to
morning.
see you, too.
Welcome.
It's great to have you here.
Well, it's fun to be here talking about genealogy. I love it.
Excellent. So we wanted to have Joan come here today because our topic is using newspapers in your genealogy research. And I learned early on in my time here at East Lake Library that Joan was a newspaper expert.
Well, I don't know that I'd say that, but I've had a lot of various success with newspapers.
Excellent. So Lois, what can you learn from using newspapers in your genealogy research?
Well, there are more topics than you can imagine because in today's newspaper, well, first of all, we don't really have print anymore. So a lot of the fun things we do to research newspapers you can't really do anymore, but you can learn everything from what we normally think of like obituaries. I mean, everybody uses a newspaper for obituaries. Births, marriages, anniversaries, all those are the basics of what you can have. But there's some older newspapers that have some interesting things too, right?
I love looking through the old newspapers from my hometown. There was one column called On the Bank Corner, and it was just things like Mr. and Mrs. Schuler went to Massachusetts this week, or, Dottie had company at her house from New Jersey.
So think of this as the Facebook of the time period.
I really think it is. It really is. And the stuff is so fun.
And you can find pictures there, too. Don't overlook those family pictures. Grandma and Grandpa had the 50th anniversary, and the picture is in the paper, especially local papers. They're really good about that.
Isn't that great?
Including vacations,
Yes.
parties, fundraisers, social clubs. If there was anything that had to do with the social environment, you found it in a newspaper. It's the only way you had information in those days.
Weddings, like they even tell you like the color of the bridesmaids' dresses.
And there were many human interest stories and interviews. Lots of good stuff about just how somebody had to deal with their cow. I mean, just fun little stories that you don't even think about, but tell you a little bit about the person. And again, takes you away from facts and figures and tells you about the human.
A great way to put your ancestor in historical context is to learn about their life.
Speaking of that, my second great grandmother in her 85th year had an article, was interviewed by the Kansas City Star and reprinted in the New York Times.
Ooh.
And she told about her life as a young lady going to the White House and meeting President Buchanan and her father being appointed a judge by President John Quincy Adams.
Ooh.
And loved to go on in the article about her clothes and how they dressed and the etiquette of the time, which of course was all set by Dolly Madison. To see her in the early 1800s as a person, a full woman, was really exciting, not just dates and places.
Yeah. That must have been so exciting, like to think that you have an ancestor who was the contemporary of Dolly Madison and you have tangible proof of that.
Yeah, well, and her personality with it. The personality that came out and told the funny stories. The newspaper article was really exciting to read.
I bet.
I know I've got one where report of a missing young girl. And turned out she had run away with her boyfriend to Chicago.
Scandal.
And how the family had to chase her down with the police getting involved because she had left a letter saying that she had done this on her own. And then later, about a year later, I found the newspaper article announcing the wedding of that young couple. And they stayed together till they passed. So you can sometimes trace a family line for quite a few years in the newspapers too. So it's very
Get
cool.
the backstory. I know also don't overlook the classifieds or the advertisements. Didn't you find a really good advertisement in your family?
In my family, my grandfather was originally in the leather business for horses. And I watched as the ads went on how he purchased a company from another one. It became Scheuermann Leather. How, as harnesses became less prevalent because automobiles, all of a sudden he started getting into Ford safety items. And then the war came, and suddenly I found him in the National Archives as well as in the newspaper, a whole article how he was making the leather straps and helmets for pilots. So how his business evolved over the years.
That's great.
And I found most all of that just listed in the newspaper. Either it was trying to sell his materials, looking for help for his materials. That's how you got that kind of information. And I was able to trace how he did in his business over the years. So yeah, classifieds are very good. And court listings. Let's not forget court listings.
Well, I have a really great newspaper article from the New York Law Journal talking about how the estate of George Cassidy will finally be settled. And the article goes on to talk about his daughter and the stepmother are fighting over the estate. And his daughter is my second great grandmother. So I have yet to find the will, but at least now I know that it probably wasn't settled for close to 8 to 10 years after his death. And that, that helped me try to channel what dates to look for when I'm looking for the probate.
Yeah.
Which is my life's work.
Looking for people
Yeah.
is another real good point for newspapers. I had a second great grandmother whose husband just disappeared. They lived down in Texas. He was working for the oil companies, and he disappeared. Now, leaving her and her 3 children. There's nothing in any of the official records about what happened to him, but you start reading newspapers from the West, and you start picking up his name. He's in Dodge doing odds and ends. The old newspapers really told about all of those people who came and went. And so she could use that then when she filed for divorce for abandonment.
Yeah. Don't they call that a grass widow?
Yes,
Yeah.
they do. But how they could use newspapers as well as you.
Wow, that's exciting.
The other piece of court is my grandfather. I found it was a court settlement. I didn't understand what it was until I realized that he had come home one day and all his furniture was gone. And the court settlement comes out, as you progress in the newspapers over the weeks, that his wife had passed and her sister went in and cleaned out the house. He won the court case. He was also looking for financial, and he didn't win that part of it, but he got all the furniture back. He had to go get it himself. But it was a funny story because I kept thinking, why is this other person's name here? I haven't figured out. And then I realized that was her maiden name, and it was her sister who had gone in and gotten all the furniture. So you start to also get links to other pieces of the family that you may not recognize if you're not looking at things like court cases. So there's lots of different articles in which you want to follow up.
Exactly.
A whole nother category are news articles, like unusual deaths and other unusual incidents that occur. Again, I'll give you an example from my family of an article. A gentleman had hung himself over a door, had committed suicide, had threatened his family. This whole article went on again, several different newspapers, different days, talked about how he was despondent, how he killed himself, and how they had found the body, which was quite a storyline in those days. Unfortunately, 2 years later, I found in the news that his daughter had followed suit, and she had drunk acid while she was in the bathroom, and her husband and 2 young children were downstairs. So obviously there's some kind of family trend there of mental illness, maybe despondency, I don't know. But you can get to learn a lot of information around unusual stories or different incidents. I think you had something
I had
like that.
a couple like that. One was, I had 2 different women that I thought could possibly be my third great grandmother. And I saw this lady was killed by the train with one of my suspects, let's say, one of my candidates to be my great grandmother. And the date that she was killed by the train, I had received my third great grandfather's pension from the Civil War, the file from the National Archives, which is totally worth the wait. And she stopped collecting the pension almost the same week that person was killed by the train. So I really do believe that woman, that Emmeline Secor, is my third great grandmother, and not the other one who lived well into the 1890s.
That's a good point. It became good corroborating evidence for you. So that's an excellent reason why newspapers can also help that we haven't even brought up yet.
Yes. And then because of the information in that, I was able to find her death certificate, her death record at the town. It definitely helped me corroborate that was indeed the person I was looking for.
That's really interesting to be able to use that to match up information and flesh out a little bit more about their life. I have a little different one in that my second great grandfather had a brother who had a missing arm, and all the pictures we had that missing arm. He was a very famous Presbyterian preacher in Toronto, Canada. And I knew that was the core of the information. I was running through some papers in Kansas, and I found in Narca, Kansas, a reprinted article from Boston newspaper that told the story of a preacher coming to Boston and lecturing and telling a story about a young Scottish boy who was 4 years old who lost his right arm in a threshing accident in Scotland. Back in the early 1800s, and how this young man's mother prayed for that boy to become a prophet because now he couldn't be a farmer. He'd lost his arm. And really was a very devout person and worked hard, got him to the University of Edinburgh. He became a student there and was in a class where it was very required that you hold the book with your right hand and read and recite. And he couldn't. He didn't have a right hand. And so the professor chastised him, and he at that point held up his missing right hand and said, "I can't." The professor turned that into a lecture on humility and teaching how to be more compassionate to people. So this gentleman now is telling the story, and standing up in the back of the room was my great-grandfather's brother, and he said, "I'm your Gaggy, I'm your man." And he just happened to be at the lecture where the preacher was telling the story in Boston.
Oh my.
You really learn some of that across the ocean stories, but the history and information about somebody in your family that nobody knew why.
So you wouldn't have known about the threshing accident without that article?
No.
You just knew he had no hands?
I knew he had no hands. We saw that from pictures, but nobody knew why.
Knew it wasn't a birth defect or something like that.
Yeah, really interesting. Newspapers can tell you so much. And just doing some of those searches by name, particularly if you have any kind of unusual name, you can find so much more than you ever thought you could.
There's a whole other area, too, that we haven't talked about, which is Black history, slavery, okay? There were lots of news articles for anybody who's doing that kind of genealogy research. It might be a runaway slave, might be for sale, some things that we don't like to think about or talk about. But if you're really trying to do some research in that area, newspapers can be a wealth of information for people. So that's another area.
Also in the Boston Pilot, there's a whole column about people looking for relatives. And they're like, Mary Mahoney came from Limerick in 1832, last seen in Boston, and her family's looking for her. A whole series of them. They're really, really beautiful to read, and could very much help somebody. Could help somebody very much if they're pinned down their person.
So we started with the births, the anniversary, all the things we think about looking for in the newspapers. Take a much broader view of newspapers when you're searching.
Sure.
Oh, yes. And never stop. Look for places along the routes where people traveled. I found another funny story of my great-grandfather's brother who kind of disappeared from the family. And I was in Salt Lake City, not doing research at that point, but I decided to pop in and just go through the LDS library there. And found
when in Rome.
Right. Found an article about this brother Not an unusual name, Frank Wash, but I learned that he disappeared because he was an alcoholic and he had left the family. He ended up being arrested, died in jail, and was in a pauper's grave in Salt Lake City. Again, plugged a hole that I never would have dreamed would have fit into our family, who were Midwesterners. So you've got to just keep thinking about what could I find?
Exactly.
And often it's there.
Yeah. And we all kind of have our ancestors on a pedestal, but the ones that we're finding in the newspapers are often our savory ancestors with some good stories to tell.
They had spiced a lot, that genealogy.
Exactly. Joan, I would be remiss if I didn't ask about the newspaper story involving your mother-in-law.
Ah, yes. My mother-in-law knew that I was into genealogy, had been for years, and had done my family. She wanted me to do hers. My mother-in-law is the oldest of 13 children, very Catholic family, very proper family. So I start doing the research, and I can't find her parents' wedding anniversary. Now, they celebrated it February 1st every year. In fact, I went as the engaged future granddaughter to their 50th. So this was a big deal in this family. And we knew they were married in Hays, Kansas, and there were no records. So after checking Kansas and Missouri, I found a marriage certificate. But that marriage certificate was Kansas City, not Hays, and it was June 12th. Now, my mother-in-law's birthday is November 9th. So
a miracle baby?
A miracle baby. So my mother-in-law told me these records could not be correct because they knew she was. We laughed for years. She said, I know it because I read a newspaper. So she pulled out the newspaper, and it said, the Hays, Kansas newspaper proudly said, another example of how Hays, Kansas women can keep a secret. Luella Bell reported she and Frank were married on February 1st. Oh, it was the June 20th edition of the newspaper. My mother-in-law made me promise I would not tell anyone until after she had passed.
And did you keep that secret?
I kept the secret. I loved my mother-in-law. But what turned out as kind of a sad part of that was when I did reveal it, her brothers and sisters and many of the cousins, now there were 75 grandchildren from this couple, had gotten married early. And everyone said, wow, if they had just known, what a wonderful example of a marriage that started out a little backwards, maybe, that had lasted at that point 60 some years. So you humanize families. And I think you take some of those people off pedestals and realize the same stories repeat and repeat and
they're
repeat.
Very common. And they didn't love that baby any less.
No.
And then the other 13 kids that they had
afterwards.
Good for them. That's great.
So with all these newspaper stories we've got,
I hope we've inspired some people.
Yeah, I think somebody out there might be saying, okay, so how do I get them?
We're the ones for my family.
I mean, I see some on Ancestry, but how do I get there?
So Ancestry, I think, has done a really great, remarkable job of giving you those hints for obituaries once you have a person rolling, and those are helpful. Where else can you find them?
Newspapers.com. And Joan, you're an expert.
Yes, newspapers.com is definitely worth the link and the time. Have the names that you're looking for, have some dates. Don't limit yourself geographically because they moved a whole lot more than what we think and didn't necessarily stay once they moved. Some came back, some went elsewhere. But newspapers.com sets up a good search engine for you for people.
Absolutely. And similarly to newspapers.com is GenealogyBank.
Yes.
I don't have a subscription to that one. I have my newspapers.com subscription. But I've used GenealogyBank, and I think it works similarly. I don't think it has as much, maybe. That's my personal opinion.
It doesn't seem to have the depth. I have it just because it has some good Midwest and Western. and actually helped me find a great-grandmother who's in Hollywood Cemetery looking at the big Hollywood sign.
Well, good for her.
And remember, we're Midwesterners,
Yeah.
so I'm
Yeah.
still working on how she got out there and why.
Oh, that's another podcast. Let us know when you solve that, please. Yeah.
And GenealogyBank. Has anybody used that?
And that's where I found it, was GenealogyBank.
Yeah.
And
That
Newspaper
was.
Archive?
I haven't used Newspaper
I haven't
Archive.
either.
I haven't either, but I'm aware of it. So if anybody tries this, let it know.
Yeah, let us know. Keep us posted on that. What about local newspapers? Do you have any good resources for local newspapers, maybe specific to regions?
I'd start with Google.
Google.
I probably would. I remember a lot of newspapers repeat articles, even today, from other newspapers.
Like the one you had
Like
that was
the one I-
reprinted from the New York Times.
The Kansas City Star, the New York Times picked that one up. The Narca, Kansas picked up articles from Boston. So newspapers try to build those bridges and fill those pages.
Sure.
It just don't overlook the greater surrounding area.
Lois and I both do a lot of research in New York State, and a good resource that I've used is Fulton Postcards or FultonHistory.com. And that's just a gentleman who had an interest in newspapers and started digitizing old newspapers in his region. I think he's up in like the Rochester area, maybe.
Something.
Yeah, and now you can go up there and you can go onto his site, and there's newspapers from not only all over the state, but I think that he's actually branched out into like Ohio and more of the Midwest.
And the site is getting easier to use.
Yes.
Again, it was very difficult to use, but
well, because it was like homemade in his basement. And he was the
Exactly.
only one, the programmer. And
don't let it scare you if you go out there. It is an
No.
excellent resource.
it really is. It really is. And if we're going to talk resources, probably the mothership would be the Library of Congress,
Absolutely.
right?
Chronicling American Digital
Yeah,
Newspapers
is their website, and they go all the way
Yes.
back to the 1700s.
something like that.
Yeah, and that's a great resource. I've gotten some stuff there that I haven't been able to find on newspapers.com.
Wikipedia.
Wikipedia is a great place to like even find the name of a newspaper,
Yeah.
Yes.
And
don't overlook local historical societies. I've contacted some of those, and members are willing to check those really small town newspapers, those weeklies that are out there. And I've gotten a lot of good information, primarily obits, but obituaries that weren't important enough to be in a bigger local newspaper.
Yeah.
So
And local libraries.
and local libraries.
I have the New Orleans Public Library, one of their branches, if I remember correctly, had a whole list of digitized newspapers that were local, and I was able to find it was New Orleans B, the French edition, and I found an obituary, and I know it's for my great grandmother aunt, and I can I needed Google Translate to read it thoroughly, but I got it.
So don't be shy about looking for local newspapers. They do exist. Now, they may or may not be digitized. And maybe they'll have to send you something. But generally, somebody has squirreled them away somewhere.
Right. But that's why it's important to visit your local libraries or their websites if you're not planning to go to the hometown soon. The historical societies, the areas that where your ancestor lived, there's going to be clues in those places. And the staff there, they can direct you. Oh, we don't have it here, but the bigger library in our county would have this. Don't be shy.
Don't be shy and look for very broad, I think you said,
Very
Joan.
broad. Yeah.
Geography, name, and don't just get stuck in marriage, obituary, birth. It's a very broad category. So I hope that's helped everybody.
There's so much to learn out there.
Such funny stories that make your ancestors real.
Absolutely.
Really real.
Well, I think that pretty much covers it for today,
I
don't
think
you?
so. I'm going to go read the newspaper. How about you?
I think that's a great idea.
Thanks so much, everybody. And thank you, Joan.
Yes, thank you, Joan. It's great having you here.
It was fun.
We'll have you back.